In this tutorial we will learn how to make ACES work in After Effects. For this we will check out the basics for our 3D setup, then switch over to After Effects to learn how to set up ACEScg workspace, and then discover how we can view, adjust and save out ACES data correctly through After Effects. So this scene in here is already set up correctly using ACEScg colorspace, and I'm not going to go into the details of how to set this up correctly in V-Ray because I have my own dedicated video in my channel, but in a nutshell you have to make sure that you use ACEScg colorspace here in the color management tab, and then also for all of your texture files and resources you have to make sure that they either are converted to ACEScg already or that you make V-Ray aware of what kind of color space they are saved in, so that it can be converted to ACEScg color space during render time. So once this is set up, we can then start the rendering and see what kind of result we will get. So this here would be the result that we're getting, and as you can see in the display correction I'm using the OCRO option, and then inside here I just loaded the latest ACES configuration file and then just defined the input color space to ACEScg and then the view transformation to sRGB because I'm using an sRGB monitor. And I would need to choose this option here to make the image show correctly on my monitor. And again, this is just a very short rundown. If you want to know more details about how to set up ACEScg correctly in V-Ray 5, check out in my channel the own dedicated video about how to do that. And if you're in general interested about how to set up a scene like this in here, how to set up car renderings, how to do lighting and shading for cars, and so on, there's also a 3-hour course on my Patreon. You can also download all of my scene files over there. But now let's go back to the display correction in here, and if I switch this to none, then this would be my fully linear image. And you can see I have an environment that has a very high dynamic range, so I have very high brightness values in here, which immediately are clipping. You can see everything turns to pure white immediately. I get these super saturated colors in here and also some kind of color banding, and it doesn't really look realistic at all. So now this sRGB option here is the linear image with some gamma curve adjusted to my monitor, but it still doesn't look anyhow realistic at all. I get this intensive clipping and so on, and I would now need to build some own tone mapping in order to make this picture here look realistic. Or I can just use this OCRO configuration file, and that has a built-in tone mapping procedure in here where everything is already done for me under the hood, and you can see it handles the colors here quite nicely. We don't get these kind of crazy saturated colors in here. This green color here look very natural, and also the same is true for these kind of bright colors in here. Nothing is really clipping, nothing is really clamping, and everything looks quite realistic and quite organic. So that is one of the advantages of using ACEScg and its built-in tone mapping, that everything like this is already standardized and you don't need to build your own tone mapping procedures in order to get a realistic result. This of course doesn't mean that you can only use ACEScg in order to generate realistic images. The same image in here you could also generate using sRGB color space, and then you would just need to build your own custom tone mapping procedure where you kind of like compress the dynamic range of the linear image of this image that you're seeing in here. You compress this dynamic range and bring it into a range that is visible on your monitor, and then you can get exactly the same or a very similar result like this. So it doesn't mean that you only have to use ACEScg in order to generate realistic images. So what I see oftentimes is that people are comparing the not tone mapped sRGB image with the already tone mapped image that comes through ACES, and that is of course a very unfair comparison because this picture in here is not finished. Basically it needs additional steps to show correctly on your monitor, and this all is already built into ACES and its view transformations in here. Anyway, that just as a short side note, that doesn't mean that ACEScg doesn't have any real advantages over sRGB. It has a lot of advantages actually, but the question is if your particular project can benefit from those advantages. So one major advantage of ACES, for example, is that you can load this kind of configuration file into any kind of software down your pipeline, in our case After Effects, And we will just save out here our linear data, so this file in here, our raw data, and then in After Effects set this up to use this kind of view transformation and also set up our color space correctly, of course, so that we are seeing the same kind of result like what we're seeing here from our V-Ray frame buffer, but we're able then to do additional modifications on our raw data here, on this unclambed raw data, and just see the result here with our ACES tone mapping. So that's why we normally would not choose this option here to save our display correction, our ACES view transformation, tone mapping, and so on into the image itself. We're just saving out here our raw linear data. And then here under Save Current Channel, I'm just calling this here motorbike. And as an image format, I just use the OpenEXR image format. Then once we save this, an additional option here will pop open. And I normally just use this half float here, so 16 bits per channel. You can in theory use also 32 bits per channel, but this will make your file size much bigger. So normally I just use this half float in here. And then the compression, I use the zip compression. But as said, all of those options here depend on your pipeline. So if you're unsure, just check whoever is in charge of your pipeline to make sure that you use the right settings in here. And then we just save this out and open it in After Effects and see how we can set up ACEScg there correctly. So now in After Effects, let me just import the image which we just rendered before. That would be this one in here. And then we can just drag this into our timeline in order to generate a new composition. So now you might notice that the image itself looks brighter than the one that we saw in the frame buffer when we switched off our display correction. And the reason for that is that After Effects uses its own kind of display correction. And here in this View tab, you can switch off this Use Display Color Management. And if you switch this off, you can see now our image looks like the raw linear data, the same way like in the V-Ray frame buffer when we switch the display correction to none. Now we just need to make sure to set up our color space correctly and then also load our ACES configuration file. So let's start by going into our composition and then just change the composition depth to 32 bits per channel. And then the workspace, we're not going to use sRGB workspace, but instead we're going to switch this one here to the ACEScg working space. And then we also make sure that we use this linearize working space option here. That should be on. So once we do this, you can see a little bit of colors are changing, but nothing too drastic yet. And we also need to make sure that if we load here our image, we go to Interpret Footage, Main, and then just make sure that we're not assigning any kind of profile. So by default, it's assigning an sRGB color profile. And we're just using this option here to preserve the RGB. That means we don't apply any kind of color profile to the imported file. We're just importing our raw data. And then we would get this result in here. So now in order to load our OCRO configuration file, we need to install a plugin, and I will show you where to download this and how to install it. So on this website in here, I will also put the link into the description, or you can also find it by just Googling for OpenColorIO for After Effects. You can download the plugin, and in my case, I had to download the one here for Windows. And then you find your After Effects installation and you go to the support files. And then in this plugins folder, I generated a new folder called OpenColorIO. And then I just put the file that we downloaded in here before and restarted After Effects in order to make sure that the plugin is loaded. So now back in After Effects, we will use the plugin that we just downloaded. And for this, in order to keep it clean, let's add a new adjustment layer, and let's call this OCIO and put this here at the very top of our composition. And then inside our effects and presets, let's find for OpenColorIO and then just drag this plugin into the adjustment layer. And now we just need to load our OCRO configuration file. And we can do this by just navigating to the path where we have it downloaded. And in my case, that would be here. And then I just open this OCRO configuration file. Once we do this, we can see first nothing happens, but we first need to set the input and output space here correctly. So the input space would be ACES and then ACEScg, and then the output space would be here output and then sRGB if you're using an sRGB monitor. Once you do this, you can see that now our image looks totally identical to what we saw in the V-Ray frame buffer when we used the same OCRO configuration file. So now in After Effects, we most likely would want to add some color adjustments and do some compositing, for example. And this we would need to do always below this OCRO adjustment layer here. And for this, let's, for example, just add a new adjustment layer, call this here color correction, and then just place this as said below this OCRO adjustment layer in here. And then inside here, for example, we can add an exposure node and just see that everything is working by just dialing down here the exposure. You can see it now really works quite good. We are not clipping anything. We're not really like making our highlights turn gray and so on. Everything works really good, and that's basically the power of ACES and being able to do all of these kind of adjustments now on the raw data and seeing everything here with our OCRO configuration file here at the very top. So again, always your color adjustments should be done below this OCRO. There shouldn't be anything here on top of this, because this one here is basically our display correction that we need to enable at the very top in order to see our image here show correctly on our monitor. So now let's say after we finished our color corrections and our compositing and so on, how do we save all of this data back into an EXR file? And that is quite simple. We just need to turn off here our display correction, so to speak, so that we're just seeing here our raw data with our color corrections. And then we just go to composition and save the frame as a file. And then inside here, we're choosing an EXR sequence, and everything here we can leave at default. So for example, we can choose no compression, or if we want to, we can also choose here our zip compression that we used earlier in order to reduce file size. But the important thing is that here in color management, we're also using this preserve RGB option in here. So that means we're not assigning any kind of output profile, and we're just saving out our linear raw data. So once we do this, then we can save our file, and now it would be saved exactly the same way like we saved it out before from the V-Ray frame buffer, just as raw linear data. If, however, After Effects would be the last step in your pipeline and you just want to save out, for example, a JPEG, you would go in and enable this OCRO adjustment layer here again, and then let's go to composition and then save frame as file and choose, in this case, for example, a JPEG sequence. And then here under color management, we make sure that everything here is left at default. So our output profile would be here our working space. And then once we save that out, we would just bake exactly the same data, what we're seeing in here, into the image, and the JPEG would look exactly like this here then, but we wouldn't be able to do any additional like deep color corrections and so on that JPEG here anymore. So there you have it. That's my personal workflow of how I tend to use ACES in After Effects. There are also different kind of workflows that all have their own advantages and disadvantages. I just found that this workflow here, for me at least, logically makes the most amount of sense and is the most easiest to understand from my opinion. So if you watched this video until here, chances are that you also enjoy the content that I provide on my Patreon, where you can also download all of my scene files, watch additional bonus videos, and also watch a whole 3-hour course on how to do, for example, shading and lighting setup for a scene like this in here. So check out this if that's interesting for you. Other than that, see you in the next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.